Ideas Beyond Borders, Campus Critical Thinking Unit. This is our first event. It's going to be small. It's going to be great. We're bringing Dr. Elham Manea. She's an associate professor at the University of Zurich. She's also a writer and a human rights advocate. Today, she's going to talk about why nonviolent extremism matters in society. She's going to have a Q&A session after this, so I hope you guys can stick around for that, and I'm sure this is going to be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And actually, I'm here also in relation to a book that was shortly published in 2nd of April this year. It's called Islamism Mainstream. And it was published in German, and I'm hoping that it will come also in English, because I wrote it in English. But that said, I will start first with an introduction, the part of the introduction that I wrote for the book, and then afterwards I will give a kind of like a personal experience that I had with radicalization, and then the kind of like consequences or lessons to understand or to take from that experience. Before the personal experience, I will also talk about how do I define nonviolent Islamism, because the issue is about nonviolent Islamism, and the main argument is basically nonviolent Islamism, from my perspective, is more, we should tackle it more seriously, rather than just focusing on the violent form of Islamism. There's something very peculiar about being neither nor. By that I mean neither right-wing nor left-wing. Being in the middle like that elicits suspicious reactions from people on both ideological camps. What do you mean you're neither? You have to be something, right? Certainly I stand for something, yet this is exactly what describes me, neither right-wing nor left-wing. I found it necessary to express this view in 2010 when I introduced myself to my colleagues at the Swiss Federal Commission for Women's Affairs. Whatever serves the rights and dignity of women, that is what I pursue. Pragmatic, yes, but principled. So please don't start pulling me into ideological battles. That is not who I am. If I don't subscribe to either of these ideological wings, then what do I stand for? I stand for all of you. And the sum of all of you is none other than the face of humanity. That is my concern, the dignity and rights of this being, the human. I believe in this humanity, in this dignity, and in these rights. That is my creed. This is my principle. Why am I telling you this? I'm sure you expected a different introduction. We have a problem, a global problem. We have a problem, a global problem, and it has a name, Islamism. But we are unable to deal with it because we are either unable to speak about it or busy fighting an ideological battle. Islamism tends to divide people in European and North American societies. Talking about it makes many people here feel uncomfortable. Not because they don't have an opinion about it, they just don't know how to talk about it. Some are afraid to talk because they don't know much about the issue. They have an opinion but don't want to treat into uncharted territory. They prefer to leave the talk to those they think know more. And very often, the religious identity of those other persons qualifies them for this talking. And very often, those who are most organized in talking about Islam and Islamism are none other than Islamists themselves. Others actually do know more about the issue and are worried about it, but they are also afraid that if they speak up, they might offend Muslims they don't want to offend. So they hold their tongues and end up censoring themselves out of an odd sense of respect. And finally, you have those who are haunted by fear, ordinary persons. They too love their countries, their traditions, and their heritage. They see changes taking place in their society. They don't like these changes. They know something is wrong, so they seek an explanation. But the issue is so blurred, so confusing, so complicated. When they talk, they tend to be angry, lashing out. In fact, expressing a sense of loss, a loss of identity. What complicates the matter is how it's being shaped by the ideological battles of the left and right. The left wing tells us there is no problem to talk about in the first place. Yes, there are jihadis blowing themselves and others up in Paris, Nice, Berlin, London, and Stockholm, but they are just disoriented, excluded youth. Poor souls. We have isolated them in our society. This is our doing. We, with our foreign policies, our discourse of discrimination, and our media that paint Islam as an angry, violent religion. We are the ones who should be blamed for creating these jihadis. In this ideological camp, you have those who acknowledge the existence of a problem, but are very worried that taking the necessary steps to address it will only supply ammunition to their far-right opponents with their us versus them discourse. So they will be damned if they will let this happen. So instead of taking concrete action in a differentiated way, they prefer to bury their heads in the sand. Their fear may be understandable, given the discourse of the far right. In every person of Islamic faith, they see a potential terrorist. Muslims, Islam, Islamism, and terrorism. To them, these words are synonymous. They stand for the same thing. They blame foreigners, migration, and immigrant for all the problems in their societies and end up exploiting Islam as a shouting banner for their racist demands. Many who consider themselves part of the right side of the ideological spectrum shun these views and oppose them vehemently. They are in the mainstream, cool-headed. They may see the issue but are hesitant to take the painful measures necessary to fight it. Too complicated, too expensive. And it will certainly hamper their government's trade and economic relations with some of their best allies. Think of the Gulf nations. And here, money does much of the job. On both sides of the spectrum, the focus is on the violent form of Islamism, the Jihadis, the terrorists, those who are committing acts of violence. They're not concerned about the non-violent forms of Islamism. The ideology and its religious message that lead the ground for this violence is not their concern. That lack of concern complicates the matter enormously. And complex is not what they need. They need simple answers and simple solutions. It's not cancer we're dealing with, just a headache. So just swallow this tablet and you'll feel better in the discussion. That won't do. Simple answers and solutions are the formula for disaster. They will only encourage the polemics of the far right. The ideology of Islamism is the core of the matter. It is what matters. Do you see why I had to tell you at the very beginning where I stand? We have a problem, a global problem, and it has a name, Islamism, But we are unable to deal with it because we're either unable to talk about it or busy fighting an ideological battle. And this clouds our judgment and makes us complicit, directly and indirectly, in mainstreaming Islamism, a totalitarian ideology. While we're busy bickering with each other, we fail to notice the slow changes taking place in our society and how they are slowly eroding the major achievement of Western democratic societies, the liberal and universal norms and values that protect the dignity and rights of the individual. So this was actually an introduction, from my perspective, a necessary one, so you would know where I stand. I don't care about ideological matters. You can do whatever you want with that. It's not my concern, and I will repeat it several times. It's not my concern. Now, if I am going to define what I mean with nonviolent Islamism, I often talk about two forms of Islamism. Okay? With nonviolent Islamism, I look at it as a spectrum. The end of it is violence. And very few actually are committing these violent acts. But what comes before is what interests me, because it's actually, it's not only paving ground for violence, it also leads to certain changes that separates communities, divide them, reflecting social cohesion, and reflect at the same time on the lives and rights of the weakest within close communities and within our societies in general. Nonviolent Islamism is a political ideology, but is also a religious interpretation. It's both. Okay? And while this is the case, together, because a political ideology that is actually based as well on a religious interpretation of Islam, they pave and propagate a form of Islam that is, because Islam is what you make of it. And you could make it a message of peace or a message of hatred. So the message of hatred seems to be the Medina form of Islam, seems to be the one that is more emphasized by these non-violent forms of Islamism and legitimize their domination and sanctions its action. We are talking about a religious far-right group. That's why when I talk, it's like in every society you have these far-right groups. This is the religious far-right groups in my societies, in my region. We're talking about two forms of Islamism, as I said. Societal Islamism, this is a form that I actually noticed during my field research in different Middle Eastern countries, where you see governments working together with certain forms of fundamentalist reading of Islam. Okay? And these movements are very often focusing on the behavior of the person, the individuals, and act as sects, separate their members from the wider society, and create division. So I'll give you one example, the Wahhabi Salafi movement of Islam. The Wahhabi Salafi movement of Islam is a new fundamentalist movement, and with that I mean it was created in the 18th century. Of course, it's based on a Salafi reading of Islam, which was earlier it existed also before. It took a real form in the 13th century, but it was brought back to this, to our modern times through this movement, Wahhabi Salafi movement in the heart of Saudi Arabia, in Najd region. created by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And at the same time, you have other versions of some new fundamentalist movements in the South Asian context, Deobandi movements and Deobandi movement and Ahl al-Hadith. But the most important part about this is the fundamentalist reading of religion, and it's not only literal in the way it looks to religion, it has certain theological principles that lead to the division that comes thereafter, once you follow it. So for instance, the Jahiliyyah is ignorance as an expression. It's well known within the religion of Islam. The way one reads it is that whatever was there before Islam was time of ignorance. Now, according to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and this Salafi reading of Islam, the idea is that everybody is living right now in Jahiliyyah at the time of ignorance. And that more or less brings them outside of the religion of Islam. And with that as well, one realizes that this principle targets not only non-Muslim societies, it targets Muslim societies as well. Tawheed is the oneness of God, monotheism. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, also based on other scholars working, was very much of the idea you have different forms of belief in the oneness of God. All people believe in the oneness of God, and at the same time, how you believe in God is another issue. How you believe in God is another issue. And from that perspective, again, that principle has led to a situation where people were basically told that they are not real Muslims, Shia, Sufi, and that because of that, the way they believe. Takfir is that a principle where excommunication, again, based on the two principles, everybody seems to be excommunicated. Al-wala' wal-bara'a, it's a very important principle because it tells you that you have to be loyal and disloyal to everything that is about belief and disloyal to those who don't believe. And that reflects on societies because you immediately, you're not supposed to say Merry Christmas to a Christian celebrating Christmas because you are with that showing loyalty to something that has nothing to do with this reading of Islam. And jihad, of course, you have times for jihad and times for not waging jihad, but it's a very core principle of this reading of Islam. The second form is political Islam. Here we have political movements, a political ideology, also modern, that came about in the 20th century. 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, were as a movement were created. Okay? But the most important aspect to understand, the Muslim Brotherhoods, they based their religious interpretation on the Salafi Islam. Just like the Deobandi Islam, Jama'at al-Islamiyya in South Asian context is based on Deobandi and Ahl al-Hadith Islam. And the common goals of the two types of Islamism, a society that is governed by what they consider God's law. This is jurisprudence, in fact, that was promulgated between the 7th and 8th century, and you can imagine that it does not reflect the concepts of human rights that we understand today, and it infringe and violate human rights and human dignity with impunity. But the idea, you have to have a society that is governed by the laws as they see it, a state where identity and citizenship are based and defined by religious affiliation and observance. Now, switch the word with religious observance with race, and you will understand how this can be a kind of a hierarchy, a state run by a chosen supreme group of Muslims. You have to read the literature, because the word supreme seems to be repeated constantly. And concepts of military and missionary jihad, in fact, most of them focus on the missionary jihad. Military jihad is often encouraged in contexts like Kashmir, like Shishan, and like Syria right now. And at the same time, they share two common features. Both starts with women and control of her behavior and body, and the preaching of an ideal Islamist word. It's very important. When they start, they start with control of her behavior, control of her body. You know? And both seek to change society gradually through a process of Islamizing society by means of the education system, the mosque, religious teachings, and the media. You have structures. And these structures work systematically to mainstream these forms of religion and ideology. However, it's very important to mention that societal Islamism lacks a systematic political ideology. It lacks it. And at the same time, they're not concerned with state building. That doesn't mean that they don't work systematically. They don't have structures, systematic structure to spread that, their reading of Islam, but they're just basically a jurisprudence. They're trying to basically do, they have a worldview, and they would like to preach it and spread it. Political Islamism, on the other hand, calls for political participation while insisting on a separate communal group Islamic identity. We are group first, okay, and foremost. Now, when it comes, as I said, I had a personal experience with this type of ideology, specifically with the Muslim Brotherhood, and you had also Salafi reading of Islam as well. It was when I was 16 years old. But you have to understand my background. My father was a diplomat. We traveled a lot. And until 16, the longest period I stayed in one country was in Morocco, 4 years. Before that, you have Germany and Iran, 3 each, and of course, Egypt and Yemen. Okay? But at the same time, I had a problem with identity because I'm half-half. They called me half. Even the word that we use in Yemen, they used in Yemen was one and a half caste. Okay? My father, the Yemeni, and my mother, the Egyptian. And I came back to Egypt, to Yemen, and it was actually the 80s, and the 80s was shaped by the Cold War. North Yemen was part of that Cold War. North Yemen was actually allied with Saudi Arabia, which was fighting on the side of the United States against the communists. South Yemen was a communist state. South Yemen was a communist state. And South Yemen was very much interested in exporting its ideology worldwide, in the Arabian Peninsula specifically. North Yemen was considered like the gate, protecting. And from that perspective, the idea was basically to get, how do we stop the advance of communism? What better idea than basically to export Saudi Arabia's reading of Islam, Wahhabi Islam, to Yemen. Erecting mosques, religious institutions, madrasas. You have 1 hour of religious ethics weekly in primary schools, secondary schools, turned into 8 hours. 8 hours weekly of Salafi Islam, changing kind of the reading of Islam within the society. And the state was very much part of that alliance with Islamist movements and Saudi Arabia. And that reflected on the way that missionary groups, Islamist groups were allowed to work within schools. So I come to the school fresh, and I see a circle of young students with a charismatic leader, and they always meet during the at the break. I asked who are these people? I was told they are pious sisters and they preach about Islam. So I started to join them. Beginning, the message was very beautiful, very peaceful. Be good to your neighbors. Always say that when someone greets you, you have to answer with a better greetings. If you see something that can be harmful to others, you have to take it away so people will not be harmed. God is loving, but of course you have to follow the right way of belief. Apparently, we're not following the right form of Islam. Societies are deviants. Our society, according to that reading. And the message started with a loving one to a ritualistic one. You have to follow this right form of Islam in order for you to be like a born-again Muslim, and as a born-again Muslim, God will basically erase all of your sins. Okay? And with the rituals, you have booklets that tells you what to do, how to pray, what to say. If you go to the bathroom, with which feet you go inside the bathroom, to be with the left. With which hand you eat, it has to be with your right hand. What do you say when you go out of your home? What do you say when you take a car? They will place the camel in the car. And I had also to wear a headscarf. God takes women and burn them in hell, holding them from their hell is filled with women, held from their hair because of the way they seduce men. And then it moved further and started to have a different kind of connotation. It's not only rituals now, there's haram and there's halal. There's what is allowed, what is forbidden. And it seems that everything seems to be forbidden. Anything that makes a civilization, music, poetry, philosophy, colors, seems to be like disappearing. I followed. And then it started to take a political connotation. It started to be troubling. You know, your mother is not really a believer. My father was a free thinker. Never lived with them. But my mother was a believer. But she's not really a believer. And then my father came. He was in Morocco. When he came, he discovered that his daughter changed. She was trying to take him back to Islam. And started to discuss with me, telling me, I understand that in your age, people always seek their identity. They seek an answer. But what you are looking at is fundamentalism. This is not what you think it is. And I started to raise my voice, started to fight with him. Now, the thing is, if you look at the arguments that were used by my group when I complained to them, they started to use the seerah, the life of Muhammad, the Prophet, in a manner making me feel that I'm part of that battle between good and bad. And at the same time, the companions of Muhammad, the Prophet, were actually willing, because of their strong belief, to renounce their parents, their sons, even fight them in the battle, and kill them. Your father is not a real Muslim, I knew that. He's unbeliever. And again, renounce your parents. Started to take another political dimension with the kind of books that I was given. Khalid al-Islamboli, the one who actually assassinated Anwar al-Sadat, was a hero. Because Anwar al-Sadat, the president of Egypt at that time, made peace with Israel. So from that perspective, he made peace with the enemies of Islam, and as well, he deserved that killing. Booklets giving you summaries of the work of the thinkers of political Islam, Ulama al-Mawdudi of Jama'at al-Islam, Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood. Even the book of Ma'alim al-Tariq, Milestones of Sayyid Qutb, it's considered the manual for Jihadis. I read it when I was 16 years. Okay? So step by step, started to start, you could see the changes in me. It's not only the headscarf, it's also the way I'm behaving. You know, instead of good morning and good evening, as I used to say, Sabah al-Khair, Masa al-Khair, as an Egyptian dialect, because I speak the Egyptian dialect of my mother, I started to use the Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. But only use it with the real believer, not with the non-believer, because we're not at peace with them. Okay? And there was a moment which actually, as it says, I started to doubt everything when they started to talk about my mother, and then with my father, they surely showed the wrong tone, because I have a very close relationship with my father. And then came a moment when our weekly meetings, because it became like systematic, but our weekly meeting took a shape where we basically started to meet outside of the school, and there was a leader, an older female leader, and she started to tell us about the duties of a wife to her husband, and saying that a woman has to obey her husband, and that Muhammad the Prophet said that one can basically, if it wasn't for the fact that it would be too much, he would actually ask the wife to pray to her husband. But that wasn't what really tipped the scale and broke this Karen's back. It was, in fact, the moment when she started to recite a certain kind of an event where it was said a woman wanted to visit her sick father. The husband said no. She went and visited him nevertheless. And then when the Prophet heard that, he said that the woman was cursed by the angels. They have a certain kind of like a background that has to do with my mother. Okay? And I felt at that moment there was something fundamentally wrong in that logic. Who should be cursed by the angels here? The husband or the woman? And I left, and I knew I would never come back to this group, and that the God that they were preaching will not provide me with salvation. Let me show you something. If I'm going to make some remarks about it, what I went through is what you could call cognitive radicalization. We're talking about radicalization as two forms, cognitive and violent. I went through a cognitive radicalization, and it's here again if radicalization is a spectrum, the last stage of which is the act of violence, this indoctrination, it was an indoctrination. This indoctrination prepared the ground for such an act of violence. Now, the most important thing is to understand, we were never asked to commit violence, but violence was presented as something legitimate. It was presented as part of a world order, part of a narrative about a world divided between two camps, and one of them is a victim. One of them is under attack and fighting against forces of evil. You know? So from that perspective, certainly dying for the defense of Islam is glorious, an act that would be rewarded generously in the afterlife. You know? And at the same time, and here, I'm saying that basically, not because I'm a fan of foreign policies of Western democracy. It's like sometimes it's like I'm really a harsh critic of American foreign policy. But here, it's very important to understand, we are dealing with an ideology that will use every tool in order to legitimize and propagate its victimhood. And certainly, great policy mistakes by leaders such as George Bush and Tony Blair are very useful to their advantage. Okay? But that said, it is not the foreign policy of Western democracy that brought this ideology into existence. It's very important to understand that. On the one hand, it's like the Wahhabi Salafi form of Islam was created in the 18th century within Najd, and Najd did not have a colonial power around. Important to mention that. And the Muslim Brotherhood were created in 1928. And while this is the case, please don't forget, there was no Iraqi war to blame for my radicalization. It was the 80s. The Americans were considered brothers, helpers. When, at that time, my group considered Americans to be the good guys because they were fighting the communists at that time. Okay? And ideology is core. I understand as scholars study and research reasons and factors for radicalization, you see a certain kind of tendency by some. That's why I talked about the ideological battles, by some to emphasize poverty and marginalizations as core catalysts for radicalization. Now, with all due respect, yes, they may play an important a role. I will put it this way. I just don't want to emphasize so much. But at the same time, if poverty is a factor, why aren't the other marginalized minorities of different faiths in the UK or France engaged in their versions of jihad? I came from an upper middle class background, really privileged, you know. And my family was an educated one. Poverty was not a factor here. What was a factor? My confusion, my searching for my identity. See, I always felt not only divided, I was shattered between several identities. Too many countries, too many nationalities. But that said, you come to a group and this group is telling you, you are one. You are one. You don't have to look for nationalities. You're a Muslim first. And that message can be very appealing. The structure is so gives you such a kind of you feel you're taken care of, you know, by the family, because the group is the family. And at the same time, please don't forget that I was searching for my identity in an Arab and a Muslim majority society. Okay? So while personal crisis and the search for an identity are crucial factors in the radicalization of youth in our societies, the ideology behind it and the group propagating it, very important, the structures, never underestimate the role of the structure, are core factor we should also consider. Important to, while I'm talking about structure, to understand that we're talking about well-organized political movements, and I'm specifically talking here about the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, what I didn't realize at the time, that these weekly meetings are actually part of the organization structure of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's called the family. You're supposed to call everybody there your sisters. If it's a male group, your brothers. They remain. It's like you are the sisters and you are the brothers, but while this is the case, the family has a leader. And you and your age. So if you're in primary school, you have your family. Secondary school, you move to another family. High school, you move to a third family. And the leader takes care of you. Make sure that you read the right stuff. Take care of your religious training. But most importantly, make sure that you read the literature of the Muslim Brotherhood, like the one that I told you about. Blah, blah, blah. And stay away from writings or individuals whose ideas are deemed secular. That's why if you make interviews with former members of Muslim Brotherhood, they tell you what started to get them away from their family was the fact that they started to read materials that contradicted what they were being told. Okay? And at the same time, you have a hierarchy. It's not easy to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, to really be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, because they consider those who are actually sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood ideology muhibbeen, lovers. Okay? But in order for you to get inside, you go through a process of vetting, and after that vetting, you're supposed to make an oath of allegiance, promising loyalty and obedience. And the organizational structure spans from neighborhood to cities to states into an international network. And it's very important to understand that because, for instance, if you're in Egypt and you're traveling to Sweden, you would like to live in Sweden, you will get a telephone number. Tell you, when you arrive to Sweden, call this number. You call this number, another leader of a family will basically take you over. Okay? It's important to understand the Muslim Brotherhood, the way they function. When I said that the leader in the family makes sure that you are trained, the way it's designed shows you a systematic effort to mainstream a radicalized ideology and reading of Islam. So it's divided according to the age and life stage of the members. They teach the Quran, the sayings of Muhammad, the Seerah, the creed through various activities and songs. Most importantly, there are certain literature that tells you how, this well-known book, Al-Seerah al-Harakiyya, Nabi, was written by a former head or leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in the 80s, and it's telling you how to use the life of Muhammad, certain chapters of the life of Muhammad in teaching the children. Al-Qaradawi has also a very important book that he wrote in the 80s about also the education, how you educate the generations. You have certain kind of volumes of curriculum. I'm not going to bother you with the names. They all disseminate a Medina Salafi form of Islam caught in a battle for the survival of Islam. I'll give you an example. Children are led to hate specific figures in Islamic history and then direct that hatred toward a general category of unbelievers. So, for instance, there is the uncle of Muhammad, Abu Lahab, who actually did not believe in Muhammad as a prophet, and he often harmed him according to the seerah that is given. Notice the instructions in the curriculum. They tell the tutor to emphasize, I hate Abu Lahab because he was kafir, unbeliever, did not believe in Allah and the Messenger, Muhammad, and he used to torture Muslims. The instructions specify the following 3 lessons the children should learn from the story, and I'm quoting here. Allah will put the kuffar, unbelievers, into the fire of hell. The Muslim hates the kuffar and loves the Muslim. And the kuffar hate Islam and hurt Muslims. Okay? You see as well the jihad part is that violence. And literally, we're talking about violence. Violence, the jihad is put as a form, you obey God when you prefer jihad through the verses and lives of Muhammad. Muslim obeys God and the Muslim loves jihad for the sake of God. And you see here the story of Abu Jahl, which was another figure in Islamic history considered an enemy of Islam and who insulted the Prophet. The children are told the story of 2 children who actually killed Abu Lahab in a battle. Okay? And that killing is put and presented as something that is not only to be rewarded, no, it's only natural and just. And Jews are also constant targets for hatred in the curriculum of the Muslim brothers. Jews are the enemies of God. The Muslim knows that the Jews are characterized by all evil, for they are cowards and traitors and cannot be trusted. This is what. And finally, the da'wah. I believe it's one of the most important dimension of the work of the non-violent Islamism, and one has to basically make sure that we understand the effect of it, and it's not about a political ideology. I have to basically emphasize this. It's the religious indoctrination that comes with it, the da'wah, missionary work that provides a strong, uncompromising religious foundation. I wasn't religious before, but during this 6 months, something really happened to me. And it was very much religious in nature, but very much stuffed with a component of a political ideology. It was very religious in nature. And with that, I'm just coming to the end of this presentation. All I'm saying, please do not ignore this form of nonviolent Islamism. Just as you stand up to far-right groups, I think we have a responsibility to stand up to this form of religious far-right groups. And I'm just hoping that we will not be indifferent. Just don't be indifferent.